A devastating truth most people refuse to accept. The more you deny your dark sides, the more they control your life. Carl Jung and Napoleon Hill revealed secrets about human nature that forever changed how we understand our failures and successes, in a way no one could have imagined. A journey of self-knowledge, transformation, and liberation from one's inner demons. Prepare yourself, because this revelation will shake your deepest convictions. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. You wake up every morning believing you know yourself. You think you understand your motivations, your desires, your fears. You've constructed a careful image of who you are, the good person, the rational decision maker, the one who always tries to do the right thing. But what if everything you've been taught about self-knowledge is just the tip of an enormous iceberg floating in the dark waters of your psyche? There's a force operating within you right now, at this very moment, that you refuse to acknowledge. It whispers in the spaces between your thoughts. It influences every choice you make, every word you speak, every relationship you build or destroy. This force doesn't care about your good intentions or your carefully crafted persona. It operates in the shadows of your consciousness, pulling invisible strings while you dance like a marionette. Convinced you're in control, Carl Jung called it the shadow. Napoleon Hill understood it as the hidden enemy within that sabotage's success, before it can take root. Both men recognized a fundamental truth that most people spend their entire lives running from. The parts of yourself you deny, reject, and push into darkness don't disappear. They grow stronger. They become the puppet master of your life, while you remain the unwitting puppet. Think about the last time you reacted to someone with unexpected anger. Where did that fury come from? Consider the moments when you've said things that surprised, even you, when words spilled from your mouth that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Reflect on the patterns in your life that keep repeating despite your best efforts to change them. The same type of toxic relationships, the same self-sabotaging behaviors, the same mysterious ways you undermine your own success just when everything seems to be going well. This isn't weakness. This isn't a character flaw. This is the shadow at work, the disowned parts of your personality that operate like a shadow government in your psyche, making decisions and influencing outcomes while your conscious mind remains completely unaware of their presence. You see, every human being is born whole, containing within themselves the capacity for every emotion, every impulse, every potential way of being. The angry child and the compassionate healer, the selfish manipulator and the generous giver, the coward and the hero, the saint and the sinner. All of these possibilities exist within you as potentials, as archetypal energies, waiting to be either integrated consciously or expressed unconsciously. But somewhere along the way, you learn to divide yourself. Your family taught you that certain emotions were unacceptable. Don't be angry. Don't be selfish. Don't be lazy. Don't be jealous. Don't be scared. Society reinforced these lessons with its own list of forbidden traits. Your religious or cultural background added more rules about what parts of human nature were shameful, sinful, or simply inappropriate. So you did what every child does to survive and be loved. You pushed those unacceptable parts of yourself into the basement of your consciousness. You locked them away in what Jung called the personal unconscious, that deep vault where all the rejected aspects of your personality continue to live, grow, and influence your life from behind the scenes. The tragedy is that in trying to be good, you didn't eliminate the capacity for these traits. You simply lost conscious control over them. The anger you refuse to acknowledge doesn't disappear. It becomes passive aggression, sarcasm, or sudden explosive outbursts that seem to come from nowhere. The selfishness you denied becomes unconscious manipulation or martyrdom that guilt trips others into giving you what you want. The laziness you rejected becomes procrastination, self-sabotage, or elaborate schemes to avoid real work while appearing busy. Every trait you've disowned becomes a force of unconscious destruction in your life. It operates through what psychologists call projection. You become hypersensitive to these traits in others because you can't tolerate seeing them in yourself. You attract people who will act out your disowned darkness for you. You create situations that force you to confront exactly what you're trying to avoid. The perfectionist who demands impossibly high standards from everyone around them is often running from their own inner sloppiness. The person who constantly criticizes others for being fake or inauthentic is usually struggling with their own masks and personas. The individual who becomes enraged by displays of selfishness is typically someone who has never learned to honor their own needs and boundaries. This is why Napoleon Hill emphasized that your greatest enemy is often yourself, not the obvious parts of yourself that you can see and work with, but the hidden parts that operate in darkness, sabotaging your efforts while you blame external circumstances for your failures. Consider for a moment the most successful people you know, either personally or through observation. Look closely at their stories. You'll often find that their greatest breakthroughs came not when they eliminated their weaknesses, but when they learned to integrate them consciously. The aggressive businessman who learned to channel his intensity into productive leadership. The sensitive artist who transformed their vulnerability into authentic, creative expression. The anxious perfectionist who discovered how to use their attention to detail as a superpower rather than a prison. The difference between those who achieve genuine success and fulfillment and those who remain trapped in cycles of self-sabotage isn't the absence of darkness. It's the conscious relationship with that darkness. It's the willingness to face what Jung called the thing a person has no wish to be. Your shadow contains not only the traits you've rejected as negative, but also positive qualities you never learned to own. The leader who dismisses their natural authority as being bossy. The creative genius who minimizes their talent as just doodling. The naturally charismatic person who hides their magnetism because they were taught that standing out is selfish or attention-seeking. These golden aspects of your shadow, your disowned gifts and talents, remain locked away alongside your rejected darkness. When you refuse to own your full spectrum of human nature, you don't just lose access to your so-called negative traits, you also lose access to the power, creativity, and authenticity that come from being whole. The cruel irony is that the very effort to be good often makes you unconsciously destructive. The person who tries to never hurt anyone often becomes a master of emotional manipulation. The individual who attempts to always be positive becomes a toxic optimist who invalidates others' genuine struggles. The one who strives to be perfectly selfless often becomes a covert narcissist who uses their giving as a way to control and guilt others. This is what happens when you try to live from only half of your humanity. You become a split person, conscious goodness shadowed by unconscious darkness. Your rejected aspects don't disappear, they simply operate underground, influencing your behavior in ways you can't see or understand. But what if there was another way? What if instead of trying to eliminate parts of yourself, you learn to integrate them? What if the goal wasn't to be perfect, but to be whole? What if your so-called negative traits weren't obstacles to overcome, but raw materials to transform? Jung discovered that every psychological problem contains within it the seed of its own solution. Your anger might become righteous passion for justice. Your selfishness might become healthy self-advocacy and boundary setting. Your fear might become prudent caution and wise preparation. Your sadness might become deep empathy and emotional intelligence. The shadow doesn't need to be eliminated, it needs to be educated. It doesn't need to be destroyed, it needs to be integrated. Like a wild horse that can either trample you or carry you to places you never imagined possible, your disowned aspects of self can become sources of tremendous power when you learn to work with them consciously. Think about the people who have had the greatest positive impact on the world. They weren't perfect beings who had eliminated all traces of human darkness. They were individuals who had learned to channel their full humanity, including their shadow aspects, toward constructive purposes. They possessed what you might call integrated intensity, the ability to be fierce and gentle, strong and vulnerable, confident and humble, passionate and peaceful. This integration doesn't happen automatically. It requires a specific kind of courage, the courage to face yourself honestly, without the filters of denial, projection, or spiritual bypassing. It requires developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold the tension between opposites within yourself until a new level of consciousness emerges. Most people spend their entire lives in one of two states, either completely identified with their persona, their acceptable public mask, or completely possessed by their shadow, acting out in ways that shock even themselves. True maturity, what Jung called individuation, involves learning to dance consciously between these polarities, accessing whatever aspect of yourself serves the highest good in any given situation. The businessman who can be ruthlessly focused when negotiating, but tenderly present when his child needs comfort. The teacher who can be stern and demanding when students need structure, but warm and encouraging when they need support. The leader who can make tough decisions that disappoint some people, while maintaining genuine compassion for everyone affected. This isn't about becoming manipulative or strategic in a calculating way. It's about becoming authentically multifaceted, able to respond from your full range of human capabilities, rather than being limited to whatever narrow band of traits you've decided are acceptable. When you begin this work of shadow integration, you'll notice something remarkable. The very people and situations that used to trigger your strongest reactions will begin to lose their power over you. Why? Because you're no longer projecting your disowned aspects onto them. You're no longer unconsciously attracted to or repelled by qualities in others that you refuse to acknowledge in yourself. You'll also discover reserves of energy you never knew you had. So much psychological energy is consumed in the constant effort to maintain your persona and repress your shadow. When you stop fighting yourself and start integrating yourself, that energy becomes available for creative expression, authentic relationship, and meaningful contribution to the world. But perhaps most importantly, you'll develop what could be called shadow immunity, the ability to remain centered and responsive rather than reactive, even in the most challenging circumstances. When you've made conscious contact with your own capacity for every human trait, very little can knock you off balance, because nothing surprises you about human nature anymore. The person who has integrated their own capacity for anger isn't triggered by angry people. They can see the pain or fear underneath the anger and respond with wisdom rather than reactivity. The individual who has owned their own selfishness isn't manipulated by selfish people. They can set clear boundaries while maintaining compassion. This is the practical promise of shadow work. Not the elimination of your humanity, but the full ownership of it. Not the perfect control of your responses, but the conscious choice of your responses. Not the absence of difficult emotions and impulses, but the mature navigation of them. Right now, in this moment, your shadow is operating. It's influencing your thoughts about what you're reading. It's coloring your reactions to these ideas. It's probably generating resistance, skepticism, or perhaps grandiose fantasies about how this knowledge will instantly transform your life. Notice this without judgment. This is simply what the psyche does when confronted with material that threatens its carefully constructed defenses. The ego mind's job is to maintain the status quo, to keep you safely locked in familiar patterns, even if those patterns are ultimately limiting or destructive. The question isn't whether you have a shadow. Everyone does. The question isn't whether your shadow is influencing your life. It always is. The real question is whether you're going to continue letting it operate unconsciously, like a hidden dictator in your psyche, or whether you're going to develop the courage to face it, understand it, and transform it into an ally. Imagine for a moment what your life would look like if you could access your full range of human capabilities consciously and constructively. Imagine the relationships you could build if you weren't constantly projecting your disowned traits onto others. Picture the creative projects you could complete if you weren't sabotaging yourself with unconscious resistance. Envision the leadership you could provide if you could draw from your complete emotional and psychological toolkit, rather than being limited to whatever narrow range of responses you've deemed acceptable. What would become possible in your life if you stopped trying to be perfect and started learning to be whole? What dreams have you abandoned because some part of you, some disowned aspect of your personality, convinced you that you weren't worthy, capable, or deserving? What patterns of self-sabotage would dissolve if you could integrate the very parts of yourself that have been creating them. The journey of shadow integration isn't easy, but it's the most practical work you can do. Every unexamined aspect of your personality that operates unconsciously is a potential source of self-sabotage. Every integrated aspect becomes a source of power, creativity, and authentic presence. This isn't therapy. This isn't about dwelling on your problems or excavating your past for its own sake. This is about reclaiming your wholeness so you can show up in the world as the complete, complex, multifaceted human being you actually are, rather than the limited, one-dimensional character you've been trying to play. The time for living in psychological exile from yourself is over. The cost of maintaining your persona while disowning your shadow is too high. You're too intelligent, too capable, and too needed in this world to continue operating at half your potential because you're afraid of your own completeness. Do you have the courage to meet yourself fully? Not just the parts you like, but all of it. Not just your strengths, but your weaknesses transformed into different kinds of strength. Not just your light, but your darkness alchemized into wisdom. The choice is yours, but remember, whether you choose to integrate your shadow consciously or not, it will continue to shape your life. The only question is whether you'll be an active participant in that process or a passive victim of it. Whether you'll be the author of your own story or a character being written by forces you refuse to acknowledge. Imagine a world where human beings took full responsibility for their complete psychological reality. Picture a society where people owned their full spectrum of emotions and impulses rather than projecting them onto scapegoats and enemies. Envision relationships built on authentic wholeness rather than carefully curated personas, hiding in fear of judgment and rejection. Look around you. Really look. See how most people move through their days like sleepwalkers, completely unconscious of the invisible forces driving their behavior. Watch how they react with surprise to their own actions, as if their emotions were weather patterns that just happened to them rather than energy systems they could learn to understand and navigate. You see it everywhere, don't you? The colleague who prides themselves on being always positive, but somehow manages to drain the energy from every room they enter with their toxic optimism and passive-aggressive comments. The friend who claims to be incredibly generous but keeps detailed mental accounts of every favor they've done, weaponizing their giving whenever they need to guilt someone into compliance. The family member who insists they never get angry, but communicates through sighs, eye rolls, and cutting remarks that slice deeper than any honest outburst ever could. This is what happens when people refuse to own their shadow. They don't become pure beings of light. They become unconscious agents of darkness, spreading the very energies they claim to have transcended while remaining completely blind to their own destructive impact. The most dangerous person in any room isn't the one who openly acknowledges their capacity for selfishness, manipulation, or aggression. It's the one who has convinced themselves they're incapable of these traits, while unconsciously expressing them in sophisticated, deniable ways. They become masters of emotional terrorism while maintaining the identity of a victim or a saint. You've met them, the perpetual victim who somehow always finds themselves in drama but never acknowledges their role in creating it. They magnetically attract chaos and conflict, but it's always someone else's fault. They've disowned their own capacity for creating problems, so they unconsciously orchestrate situations where others will create problems for them. This allows them to maintain their victim identity while still getting the drama and intensity their shadow craves. Or consider the nice person who never says no, never sets boundaries, never expresses a preference, but somehow everyone around them ends up feeling guilty, exhausted, or manipulated. They've rejected their natural assertiveness and healthy selfishness, so these qualities express themselves through martyrdom and covert control. They give and give until you feel indebted, then collect on that debt through guilt, obligation, and emotional manipulation, all while maintaining the persona of selfless generosity. The spiritual bypasser is perhaps the most tragic example. They use meditation, positive thinking, and spiritual concepts as sophisticated forms of denial. I don't get angry anymore, I've transcended that. Everything happens for a reason. I only focus on love and light. Meanwhile, their disowned anger leaks out as judgment toward less evolved people. Their rejected sadness becomes depression that they label as spiritual purification. Their denied fear becomes rigid control disguised as spiritual discipline. These people haven't transcended their humanity. They've just found more sophisticated ways to be unconscious of it. They've painted their shadow in bright colors and called it enlightenment, but it's still the shadow running the show. Let me tell you about Marcus, a composite of patterns I've observed countless times in the realm of unconscious shadow expression. Marcus was a successful entrepreneur who built his identity around being brutally honest and completely authentic. He prided himself on his directness, his willingness to tell people what they needed to hear, his reputation for cutting through BS and getting to the truth. Marcus had completely disowned his own capacity for manipulation, people-pleasing, and diplomatic deception. He saw these traits as weaknesses, characteristics of fake people who lacked his courage and integrity. He built his entire persona around being the opposite of everything he despised about human nature. The shadow always gets its due. Marcus's disowned people-pleasing expressed itself as its opposite extreme, a compulsive need to be brutally honest, even when kindness or tact would have been more appropriate. His rejected manipulation became manipulative honesty, using truth as a weapon to control others through intimidation and shame. His denied diplomatic skills became a rigid inability to navigate social nuance, costing him relationships and business opportunities. But the real tragedy was that Marcus attracted and created exactly what he claimed to despise. His business partnerships consistently involved people who were manipulative and fake, because his unconscious mind magnetized these qualities to balance his rejected shadow aspects. His relationships were filled with drama and deception because he couldn't recognize these energies when they were subtle. He could only see them when they were extreme enough to justify his rageful reactions. Marcus would explode with fury whenever he encountered dishonesty or manipulation, never recognizing that his extreme reactions were signs of his own disowned material being triggered. He was like a person who had never owned their own sexuality, becoming obsessively focused on the sexual behavior of others. The intensity of the reaction always reveals the presence of disowned shadow material. The pattern accelerated when Marcus started a company with a business partner who seemed to share his values of radical honesty and authenticity. Within 6 months, this partner had embezzled money from the company and manipulated several key clients into side deals that excluded Marcus entirely. When Marcus discovered the betrayal, his reaction was so extreme, so filled with shocked rage and disbelief, that it destroyed not only the partnership, but several other business relationships. His inability to recognize manipulation when it was happening cost him his ability to respond appropriately when it was discovered. He had been so identified with being honest that he had become unconsciously naive, an easy target for the very behaviors he claimed to despise. The aftermath was devastating. Marcus spiraled into a depression that he couldn't understand. "I did everything right," he would tell anyone who would listen. "I was completely honest about everything. I trusted people to be as authentic as I was. How could this happen to me?" What Marcus couldn't see was that his rigid identification with honesty had made him dishonest with himself about his own capacity for manipulation, strategic thinking, and healthy suspicion. By disowning these qualities entirely, he had become unconsciously manipulative, using his honesty as a form of control, his authenticity as a weapon, his directness as a defense against the vulnerability of genuine intimacy. Marcus had attracted exactly what he needed to learn about his own shadow, but he was too identified with his persona to recognize the gift. Instead of seeing the betrayal as an invitation to integrate his own rejected aspects, he used it as evidence that the world was full of terrible people and he was a victim of their awfulness. This is the tragedy of shadow denial. It doesn't protect you from the traits you're trying to avoid. It makes you unconsciously express them while attracting them from others in their most destructive forms. Marcus needed to learn healthy manipulation, influence, persuasion, strategic communication, appropriate suspicion, discernment, due diligence, boundary awareness, and constructive deception, discretion, privacy, tactical information sharing. But because he had labeled these capacities as entirely negative, he remained unconsciously vulnerable to their destructive expressions. The pattern repeated itself throughout Marcus's life until he finally hit a wall that couldn't be explained, away by external circumstances. His health began to deteriorate under the stress of constant conflict. His remaining relationships became increasingly superficial because people found his rigid honesty exhausting and emotionally unsafe. His business ventures kept failing because he couldn't navigate the complex social and political realities of human collaboration. Marcus represents millions of people who have built their identities around rejecting certain aspects of human nature, only to find themselves unconsciously possessed by these very qualities in their most destructive forms. The person who has completely disowned their anger becomes prone to passive-aggressive behavior that's far more damaging than clean, direct anger would be. The individual who has rejected their natural selfishness becomes martyrish and manipulative, getting their needs met through guilt and obligation rather than honest request. The nice person who never rocks the boat often creates more chaos than someone who is willing to have difficult conversations directly. The humble person who can never accept compliments or acknowledge their achievements often has a grandiose shadow that expresses itself through false modesty and covert superiority. The rational person who has rejected their emotional nature often makes terrible decisions because they lack access to the wisdom of their feelings. You see this pattern playing out on a massive scale in our culture. We've created a society of people who are desperately trying to be good, while unconsciously expressing all the qualities they're trying to transcend. Social media is filled with virtue signaling from people whose private behavior contradicts their public positions. Politicians who campaign on family values while living lives of secret corruption. Spiritual teachers who preach love and unity while building empires based on manipulation and exploitation. The collective shadow of our culture is expressing itself through the very people who claim to be most enlightened, most evolved, most conscious. We've created what could be called unconscious inflation. People who have become identified with their positive qualities while completely denying their capacity for the opposites, making them unconscious agents of exactly what they claim to oppose. This is why our world feels increasingly polarized and chaotic. We have millions of people who are unconsciously possessed by their disowned shadows, while believing they're examples of conscious evolution. They project their rejected aspects onto political opponents, different religions, other cultures, creating enemies and scapegoats to carry what they refuse to own about themselves. The person who is obsessed with calling out racism in others while never examining their own prejudices and biases. The individual who is constantly identifying toxic behavior in their relationships while remaining blind to their own manipulative patterns. The activist who fights against oppression while unconsciously oppressing anyone who disagrees with their methods or perspectives. This unconscious shadow expression is far more dangerous than honest acknowledgement of human darkness would be. At least the person who knows they're capable of selfishness can make conscious choices about when and how to be selfish. The individual who admits their capacity for manipulation can choose to use influence skills constructively rather than destructively. The one who owns their natural aggression can channel it into productive assertiveness rather than letting it leak out as passive hostility. But the person who has completely disowned these capacities becomes an unconscious puppet of them. They can't make conscious choices about traits they refuse to acknowledge. They can't develop healthy expressions of qualities they've labeled as entirely negative. They become walking contradictions, preaching light while spreading darkness, claiming evolution while remaining unconsciously primitive, demanding authenticity while living behind elaborate masks of spiritual or moral superiority. The cost of this unconscious living is enormous. Relationships built on personas rather than authentic wholeness inevitably become superficial or explosive. Careers built on denying rather than integrating your full humanity become sources of chronic stress and burnout. Personal development that focuses on elimination rather than integration creates internal war, rather than genuine transformation. You can see it in the epidemic of anxiety and depression in our culture. When you're constantly trying to be someone other than who you actually are, when you're fighting a war against aspects of your own nature, when you're living in fear that your dark side might be discovered, the psyche rebels. Anxiety becomes the constant background hum of a split self, trying to maintain an impossible standard. Depression becomes the inevitable result of rejecting too much of your own life force. The most tragic part is that these people are often the ones most committed to personal growth and positive change. They're not lazy or uncommitted. They're working incredibly hard to improve themselves, but they're using a fundamentally flawed strategy that creates the opposite of what they're trying to achieve. They're like people trying to build a house while refusing to acknowledge that they need a foundation. No matter how beautiful the structure they attempt to create, it will eventually collapse. Every self-help book they read that promises to eliminate negative traits makes the problem worse. Every spiritual practice they adopt that encourages them to transcend rather than integrate their humanity creates more internal fragmentation. Every motivational speaker who tells them they can think their way out of being human adds another layer to their persona while driving their shadow deeper underground. This is the cruel irony of most personal development. It often makes people more unconscious, not less. It provides sophisticated language and concepts for denial and spiritual bypassing. It creates communities of people who compete to be the most positive, the most evolved, the most free from human limitations. All while their shadows run amok behind the scenes. Watch carefully and you'll see the signs everywhere. The meditation teacher who is serene in public but tyrannical with their family. The life coach who can't maintain a stable relationship. The motivational speaker who struggles with addiction or depression. The spiritual guru who builds an empire. On the labor of devoted followers who work for free while believing they're serving a higher purpose. These aren't examples of hypocrisy in the traditional sense. They're examples of what happens when people try to live from only half of their humanity. The disowned aspects don't disappear. They become unconscious and therefore unmanageable. They express themselves in the spaces between the persona, in the areas of life that feel private or unobserved, in moments of stress when the conscious control slips. The saddest part is watching people blame themselves for their inability to maintain impossible standards of perpetual positivity, constant growth, and elimination of all negative traits. They think they're failing at personal development, when actually they're succeeding at something much more destructive, the systematic rejection of their own wholeness. What would happen if you refused to continue this exhausting charade? What if you stopped trying to eliminate parts of yourself and started learning to work with all of yourself? What if the goal wasn't to become perfect, but to become whole, not to transcend your humanity, but to embrace it fully and consciously? What if the very traits you've been trying to eliminate actually contain the keys to your authentic power and genuine contribution to the world? What if your anger could become righteous passion, your selfishness could become healthy self-advocacy, your manipulation could become skillful influence, your fear could become wise caution? The path forward isn't more denial, more spiritual bypassing, more attempts to eliminate your shadow. It's the courageous choice to turn toward yourself completely, not just the parts you like, but all of it. Not just your strengths, but your weaknesses transformed through conscious integration. Not just your light, but your darkness alchemized into wisdom. Are you ready to stop living a half-life? Are you willing to reclaim the energy you've been using to maintain impossible personas and redirect it toward authentic wholeness? Are you prepared to join the rare ranks of truly conscious human beings who have learned to dance with their complete humanity rather than fighting an endless war against themselves? The choice is before you, but choose quickly. Every day you continue trying to be someone other than who you actually are is another day your shadow grows stronger in the darkness of your denial. Every moment you spend rejecting aspects of your own nature is energy that could be used for creative expression, authentic relationship, and meaningful contribution to a world that desperately needs whole human beings rather than fragmented personas pretending to be perfect. And if you decide to make a different choice, if you choose the path of integration rather than elimination, wholeness rather than perfection, consciousness rather than denial, what kind of person would you become? What would become possible in your life when you stop fighting yourself and start working with yourself? The great minds who have studied human nature most deeply all arrived at the same revolutionary conclusion. The attempt to eliminate parts of yourself leads to psychological fragmentation, while the conscious integration of all aspects leads to genuine power and authenticity. This isn't mystical theory, it's practical psychology backed by decades of observation and application. Carl Jung spent his entire career documenting what he called the individuation process, the journey towards psychological wholeness that requires facing and integrating the shadow. Through thousands of hours with patients, he discovered that every neurosis, every stuck pattern, every self-defeating behavior could be traced back to disowned aspects of the personality operating unconsciously. He found that healing didn't come from eliminating the problematic traits, but from bringing them into conscious relationship where they could be transformed from destructive forces into constructive ones. Napoleon Hill, through his study of the most successful individuals of his era, identified what he called the enemy within, the unconscious patterns that sabotage success before it can fully manifest. In Think and Grow Rich, and his lesser-known works, Hill repeatedly emphasized that achievement isn't about positive thinking alone, but about developing conscious mastery over all aspects of your psychology, including the parts you'd rather not acknowledge. Viktor Frankl, who witnessed human nature under the most extreme conditions in Nazi concentration camps, observed that the people who maintained their dignity and sanity weren't those who tried to eliminate their capacity for hatred, despair, or selfishness. They were the ones who could acknowledge these potentials within themselves while choosing to act from their higher nature. Frankl understood that psychological freedom comes not from the absence of difficult emotions, but from the conscious choice of how to respond to them. James Clear, in his groundbreaking work on habit formation, identified that lasting behavioral change requires what he calls identity-based habits, changes that align with who you believe yourself to be. But here's what most people miss. If your identity is based on rejecting aspects of human nature rather than integrating them, your habits will constantly be undermined by the unconscious expression of your disowned traits. The person who builds their identity around never being angry will unconsciously sabotage their progress through passive-aggressive behavior that they don't recognize as anger. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who understood human nature from the extreme perspective of slavery and liberation, taught that freedom comes not from controlling external circumstances, but from developing conscious choice over your internal responses. But this conscious choice is impossible when half of your internal responses are disowned and operating unconsciously. True Stoicism requires owning your complete emotional and psychological reality, while choosing which aspects to express and how. These thinkers understood something that modern personal development often misses. The psyche operates like a hydraulic system. When you try to eliminate one quality, it doesn't disappear. It gets displaced into other expressions. Push down your anger, and it becomes passive aggression. Reject your selfishness, and it becomes martyrdom and manipulation. Deny your fear, and it becomes rigid control. Disown your sadness, and it becomes chronic depression. Think of your psyche as a river system. Every human quality, anger, sadness, fear, joy, selfishness, generosity, aggression, tenderness, represents a tributary feeding into the main current of your life force. When you try to dam up certain tributaries because you've labeled them as negative, you don't stop their flow. You create underground streams that eventually surface in unexpected places, often causing more damage than the original river would have if allowed to flow openly. The integrated person isn't someone who has eliminated negative traits. They're someone who has learned to navigate the full river system of their humanity. They can access righteous anger when injustice needs to be confronted, healthy selfishness when boundaries need to be set, strategic thinking when complex situations require navigation, and fierce protectiveness when something precious needs defending. Consider the metaphor of the master swordsmith. Raw metal contains both strength and brittleness, hardness and flexibility. The amateur smith tries to eliminate what they perceive as weaknesses in the metal, creating a blade that appears perfect but shatters under pressure. The master smith understands that the apparent weaknesses are actually essential qualities that, when properly integrated through heat and pressure, create a blade that is both strong and flexible, capable of holding a sharp edge while bending. Rather than breaking, your psychological material is similar. What you perceive as weaknesses, your anger, your selfishness, your fear, your sadness, are actually raw materials that contain essential qualities for psychological resilience and authentic power. The amateur approach tries to eliminate these qualities, creating a personality that appears admirable but lacks the flexibility and strength to handle real-world challenges. The master approach integrates these qualities through the heat and pressure of conscious work, creating a character that is both compassionate and fierce, gentle and strong, vulnerable and resilient. Jung called this process holding the tension of the opposites. Instead of trying to resolve the contradiction between your light and dark qualities by eliminating one side, you learn to hold both simultaneously until a new level of consciousness emerges, what he called the transcendent function. This isn't about finding a middle ground or compromising between extremes. It's about developing the psychological capacity to access whatever quality serves the highest good in any given situation. The person who has integrated their shadow doesn't become wishy-washy or morally relativistic. They become more decisive, not less, because they have access to their complete range of human capabilities. They can be gentle when gentleness serves love, and fierce when fierceness serves love. They can be generous when generosity serves growth, and appropriately selfish when boundary setting serves everyone's well-being. This is what Napoleon Hill meant when he wrote about developing accurate thinking. Accurate thinking isn't just logical analysis. It's the ability to see situations clearly without the distortion that comes from projecting your disowned traits onto others. When you've integrated your own capacity for manipulation, you can recognize it in others without being triggered or naive. When you've owned your own selfishness, you can navigate situations involving selfish people with wisdom rather than reactivity. The literature of human transformation consistently points to this same truth. Psychological maturity isn't about becoming pure or perfect, but about becoming conscious and integrated. The Jungian analysts who worked with the most successful individuals found that they all shared one quality. They had learned to own their complete psychological reality while choosing consciously how to express it. Consider the metaphor of the complete emotional keyboard. Most people try to play the symphony of their lives using only the white keys, believing the black keys represent negative emotions that should be avoided. But you cannot play beautiful music. You cannot create a rich, complex, satisfying life using only half the available notes. The black keys aren't wrong or bad. They create the depth, richness, and complexity that make music emotionally compelling. Your anger is a black key that creates intensity and passion when played skillfully. Your sadness creates depth and empathy. Your fear creates prudence and preparation. Your selfishness creates healthy boundaries and self-advocacy. When you try to play your life symphony without these notes, the music becomes flat, predictable, and ultimately boring, both to you and to everyone around you. The shadow integration work that Jung pioneered and that modern psychology has refined isn't about indulging your dark impulses. It's about developing the skill to play the complete keyboard of human emotion and motivation. It's about learning when to press the anger key to create passionate advocacy for justice, when to touch the sadness key to create genuine empathy for suffering, when to strike the fear key to create wise caution in dangerous situations. This requires what Epictetus called the discipline of desire, not the elimination of difficult emotions, but the conscious choice of when and how to express them. Integrated person doesn't lack capacity for anger. They have conscious choice about when anger serves and when it doesn't. They don't lack selfishness. They can be appropriately self-interested when the situation calls for it, without being consumed by narcissistic self-absorption. Viktor Frankl observed that the prisoners who survived the concentration camps with their humanity intact were those who could acknowledge their capacity for hatred, despair, and selfishness, while choosing to act from love, hope, and service. They didn't survive by pretending they were incapable of dark emotions. They survived by owning these capacities while choosing not to be controlled by them. This points to a crucial distinction that most personal development misses. There's a difference between having a capacity and being possessed by it. The person who has never owned their anger is often possessed by it when it surfaces. They explode inappropriately because they have no conscious relationship with their own intensity. The person who has integrated their anger can access it consciously and proportionally when the situation genuinely calls for it. James Clear's research on habit formation reveals why willpower-based approaches to personal change have such low success rates. They require constant energy to maintain because they're working against essential aspects of human nature rather than with them. The person who tries to eliminate their natural aggression through willpower will constantly struggle with passive-aggressive behavior. The individual who attempts to transcend their selfishness through effort will repeatedly undermine their own success through martyrish manipulation. But the person who learns to transform their aggression into assertiveness, their selfishness into healthy self-advocacy, their manipulation into skillful influence, they're working with their natural, psychological material rather than against it. Their changes feel effortless because they're aligning with their complete nature rather than fighting it. Think of your psyche as a wild ecosystem. Every emotion, every impulse, every capacity exists for a reason. It serves some function in the complete system of your humanity. The amateur approach to personal development is like trying to improve an ecosystem by eliminating all the predators, all the decomposers, all the elements that seem negative or dangerous. This creates an unstable system that eventually collapses because it lacks the natural checks and balances that maintain health. The master approach recognizes that every element in the psychological ecosystem serves a purpose when properly integrated. Your anger is the predator that protects your boundaries and eliminates threats to your well-being. Your sadness is the decomposer that breaks down what's no longer serving so new growth can emerge. Your fear is the early warning system that helps you navigate danger and uncertainty. When these functions operate unconsciously, they become destructive, like predators that attack indiscriminately or decomposers that break down healthy tissue. But when they're brought into conscious relationship, they become essential components of psychological health and effectiveness. This is why the greatest leaders throughout history have been individuals who could access their complete range of human capabilities consciously. They could be compassionate and ruthless, gentle and fierce, humble and confident, depending on what the situation required. They weren't split people trying to maintain impossible standards of perpetual positivity. They were whole people who had learned to dance consciously with their complete humanity. Napoleon Hill's study of successful individuals revealed that they all shared this quality of integrated intensity. They could channel their anger into passionate pursuit of their goals. They could use their selfishness to maintain the boundaries and self-care necessary for sustained achievement. They could employ their natural capacity for strategic thinking, what others might call manipulation, to influence situations in positive directions. The key insight from all this research is simple but revolutionary. If constantly fighting against essential aspects of human nature leads to fragmentation and unconscious expression of these traits, then consciously integrating these aspects leads to wholeness and conscious choice over their expression. If denial creates unconscious possession by your disowned qualities, then ownership creates conscious mastery over them. This isn't moral relativism or an excuse for destructive behavior. It's recognition that true ethical development requires owning your complete capacity for both construction and destruction, so you can choose consciously which to express in any given situation. The person who denies their capacity for cruelty often becomes unconsciously cruel through neglect, dismissal, or passive aggression. The individual who owns their capacity for cruelty can choose to be strategically fierce when protection is needed, while remaining fundamentally committed to reducing suffering. Your shadow contains not only the qualities you've rejected as negative, but also positive capacities you've never learned to own, your natural leadership abilities that you've minimized as being bossy, your creative genius that you've dismissed as just messing around, your intuitive wisdom that you've rejected as not logical enough, your charismatic magnetism that you've hidden because you were taught that standing out is selfish. The integration process requires reclaiming all of it, the gold and the lead, the light and the dark, the qualities you've been taught to celebrate and the ones you've been taught to hide. When you stop expending enormous amounts of energy trying to be someone other than who you actually are, that energy becomes available for creative expression, authentic relationship, and meaningful contribution to the world. This is the promise of shadow work, not the elimination of your humanity, but the full ownership of it, not perfect control over your responses, but conscious choice of your responses, not the absence of difficult emotions and impulses, but the mature navigation of them, not the transcendence of human nature, but the transformation of human nature. Through conscious relationship with all its aspects, the architecture of wholeness isn't built by eliminating flaws you don't like. It's built by learning to use every flaw of your psychological building consciously and constructively. Your basement of primal emotions, your ground floor of daily personality, your upper floors of aspirational ideals, all are necessary components of a complete human structure. When you try to live only in the upper floors while denying the foundation, the building becomes unstable and eventually collapses. When you integrate all levels consciously, you create a structure that can weather any storm while providing a stable platform for whatever you want to build in the world. The question isn't whether you're willing to acknowledge that you have a basement. You do, and it's already influencing every other floor of your life, whether you admit it or not. The question is whether you're going to continue letting it operate unconsciously, or whether you're going to turn on the lights, clean it up, and transform it into the foundation for authentic power and contribution it was always meant to be. Stop waiting for the perfect moment to begin this work. Stop believing you need years of therapy or expensive workshops to start integrating your shadow. The transformation begins today, with practices so simple they might seem almost too ordinary to create profound change. But this is how real mastery works, through consistent daily choices that gradually shift the entire foundation of how you relate to yourself and the world. First practice, the mirror of reactivity. Pay attention to your emotional reactions throughout the day, especially the ones that seem disproportionate to the situation. Your strongest reactions are doorways into your shadow material. When someone triggers intense anger, judgment, or discomfort in you, resist the urge to immediately focus on what's wrong with them. Instead, turn your attention inward and ask, what aspect of myself am I seeing reflected in this person? This morning, when your co-worker interrupts you for the third time during a meeting, notice the surge of irritation. Instead of mentally cataloging all the ways they're being rude and inconsiderate, pause. Ask yourself, when do I interrupt others? When do I prioritize my agenda over someone else's need to complete their thoughts? You might discover that your intense reaction comes from seeing your own impatience and self-centeredness reflected back to you. Practice this with every strong reaction. The neighbor who plays music too loudly becomes a mirror for your own inconsideration toward others. The friend who's always late reflects your own relationship with time and other people's schedules. The family member who gives unsolicited advice shows you your own tendency to believe you know what's best for others. Don't use this practice to justify bad behavior in others or to blame yourself for their actions. The goal isn't to excuse inappropriate behavior, but to reclaim the energy you're spending on judgment and use it for self-awareness instead. When you stop projecting your disowned traits onto others, you gain tremendous psychological energy and clarity. Record these observations in a simple format. I had an intense reaction to person situation because they displayed specific behavior. This bothers me because I have this same capacity but have tried to reject it in myself. I express this trait through specific examples of how this quality shows up in your own behavior. The practice works because projection always involves disowned aspects of yourself. You cannot be strongly triggered by a quality that you've genuinely integrated and owned. The person who has made peace with their own selfishness isn't triggered by selfish people. They can respond to the behavior appropriately without being emotionally hijacked by it. Second practice, the daily shadow inventory. Each evening, before you sleep, conduct a brief inventory of the day's events through the lens of shadow integration. Ask yourself, what traits did I express today that I normally try to hide or deny? What qualities did I judge in others that might exist in me? What emotions did I feel but not acknowledge? What impulses did I have but immediately suppress? Be specific and honest. Today I felt jealous when my colleague got recognition for a project, but I told myself I was just concerned about fairness. I manipulated my partner into choosing the restaurant I wanted by suggesting all the other options had problems. I felt satisfied when my friend's relationship hit a rough patch, even though I expressed sympathy. This isn't about beating yourself up or confessing sins. It's about developing accurate self-awareness that includes your complete range of human responses. Most people live in a constant state of self-deception, aware only of their acceptable emotions and impulses while remaining blind to everything else. The shadow inventory helps you develop what psychologists call metacognition, awareness of your own mental processes. When you can observe your jealousy, manipulation, or satisfaction at others' misfortune, without immediately judging these responses as bad, you begin to develop conscious choice over them. Write down 1 or 2 observations each night. Keep it simple. Today I noticed specific trait or emotion in myself when specific situation occurred. Usually I would, how you normally handle this, but I'm acknowledging it instead. The practice becomes transformative when you stop trying to eliminate these traits and start understanding their function. Your jealousy contains information about what you truly want. Your manipulation reveals your unmet needs and fear of direct communication. Your satisfaction at others' struggles might point to areas where you feel powerless in your own life. Third practice, the integration dialogue. Once you've identified a shadow trait through reactivity or daily inventory, engage it in conscious dialogue. This isn't positive thinking or trying to transform negative traits into positive ones. It's learning to work with your complete psychological material as an integrated system. Let's say you've noticed that you become intensely critical of people who seem entitled or demanding. Instead of trying to eliminate your critical nature, have an internal conversation with this part of yourself. Critical voice, I notice you become very active when you perceive entitlement in others. What are you trying to protect? What do you need me to understand? Often you'll discover that your critical voice is trying to protect you from being taken advantage of, or it's expressing your own unmet needs for recognition and consideration. The criticism isn't the problem. It's valuable information about boundaries, values, and unacknowledged desires wrapped in judgmental language. Practice this with any trait you've been trying to eliminate. Have a conversation with your anger. What injustice are you responding to? What boundary has been crossed? What action do you want me to take? Dialogue with your sadness. What loss are you helping me process? What needs to be grieved? What healing are you trying to facilitate? The goal is to transform your relationship with these aspects from resistance to collaboration. Instead of I shouldn't be angry, practice, my anger is telling me something important about this situation. What is it? And how can I respond effectively? This practice works because every emotion and impulse serves a function when understood correctly. Your anger protects your boundaries and signals injustice. Your sadness processes loss and creates empathy. Your fear alerts you to danger and promotes preparation. Your selfishness ensures your needs are met and your energy is preserved. When you fight these responses, you lose access to their wisdom. When you dialogue with them, they become allies rather than enemies. Fourth practice, the conscious expression. Experiment. Choose one trait you've been trying to eliminate and experiment with expressing it consciously and constructively. If you've been trying to eliminate anger, practice expressing it appropriately when genuine boundaries are crossed. If you've rejected your selfishness, practice saying no to requests that don't align with your values or energy. Start small and be strategic. If you've never allowed yourself to be openly angry, don't begin with a confrontation with your boss. Practice with low-stakes situations. When a telemarketer interrupts your dinner, instead of being politely dismissive, try a firm, clear, "I'm not interested. Please remove my number from your list." Notice how it feels to express intensity without being cruel or inappropriate. If you've always been the person who says yes to everything, practice declining invitations or requests that you would normally accept out of guilt or obligation. "Thanks for thinking of me, but I won't be able to participate." No lengthy explanations or apologies. Notice the discomfort and the relief that come with setting clear boundaries. The key is conscious choice rather than unconscious expression. You're not indulging your rejected traits. You're learning to use them skillfully when the situation calls for it. The person who has integrated their anger can be fierce when protection is needed while remaining fundamentally committed to reducing conflict. The individual who has owned their selfishness can prioritize their needs when necessary, while still being genuinely generous in other contexts. Track the results of these experiments. When I expressed trait consciously in situation, the result was specific outcome. I felt emotions. Others responded by specific responses. I learned insights about this trait's constructive potential. Many people discover that the conscious, appropriate expression of their negative traits actually improves their relationships and increases their effectiveness. People respect clear boundaries more than resentful compliance. Honest anger about genuine injustice creates more positive change than passive-aggressive. Manipulation. Strategic selfishness that maintains your energy and integrity allows you to be more genuinely generous than martyrish giving. Fifth practice, the projection reclamation process. Whenever you find yourself in conflict with someone or obsessively thinking about someone else's behavior, use the situation as shadow work material. Strong, persistent emotional reactions to others are almost always projections of disowned aspects of yourself. Ask yourself these specific questions. What qualities in this person am I most bothered by? Where do these same qualities exist in my own behavior, perhaps expressed differently? What would it look like to own these traits rather than projecting them? If you're dealing with someone you perceive as manipulative, examine your own relationship with influence and control. Do you manipulate through giving in order to create obligation? Do you use emotional displays to control situations? Do you withhold information to maintain power? The manipulator in your life is showing you something about your own relationship with power and influence that you haven't fully owned. Practice this reclamation by completing this sentence. I am bothered by person because they are specific trait. I express this same trait by specific examples. If I owned this capacity fully, I could constructive expression instead of current unconscious expression. The goal isn't to excuse inappropriate behavior in others, but to reclaim the energy you're spending on them and redirect it toward your own development. When you own your complete capacity for manipulation, you can recognize it in others without being triggered and respond more effectively to protect yourself. This practice often reveals that the people who trigger you most intensely are actually teachers showing you disowned aspects of yourself that need integration. The obnoxious person who demands attention might be showing you your own unmet needs for recognition. The overly emotional person might be reflecting your own suppressed feelings. The controlling person might be mirroring your own need for security and order. The integration of daily practice. These 5 practices work together to create a complete system for shadow integration. The mirror of reactivity identifies your shadow material. The daily inventory increases your self-awareness. The integration dialogue transforms your relationship with rejected traits. The conscious expression experiment teaches you to use these traits constructively. The projection reclamation process helps you learn from your relationships and conflicts. Practice all 5 consistently for 30 days, and you'll notice profound shifts in your emotional reactivity, your relationships, and your sense of personal power. You'll stop being unconsciously controlled by traits you refuse to acknowledge. You'll develop the ability to respond rather than react. You'll reclaim enormous amounts of energy that you've been using to maintain impossible standards of perpetual positivity. The work isn't comfortable. Acknowledging your capacity for selfishness, manipulation, cruelty, or pettiness challenges the carefully constructed image you've built of yourself as a good person. But this discomfort is the price of psychological freedom. Every trait you refuse to own owns you instead. Every aspect of yourself you try to eliminate operates unconsciously, creating the very problems you're trying to avoid. Remember, the goal isn't to become someone who expresses every impulse or indulges every emotion. It's to become someone who has conscious choice over their complete range of human capabilities. The integrated person isn't controlled by their anger, their sadness, their fear, or their selfishness, but they can access these qualities consciously when the situation genuinely calls for them. Start today. Choose one practice and begin immediately. Don't wait until you feel ready or until you understand everything perfectly. Shadow work is learned through practice, not through theory. Every day you delay is another day these unconscious forces continue to operate in your life without your awareness or consent. Your wholeness is waiting for you to claim it. Your authentic power is locked away in the very traits you've been trying to eliminate. Your genuine contribution to the world requires access to your complete emotional and psychological toolkit, not just the sanitized version you've been trying to maintain. The time for living as half a person is over. The practices are simple, but they require the kind of courage that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The courage to meet yourself completely, without the filters of denial or the protection of carefully maintained personas. Are you ready to discover what becomes possible when you stop fighting yourself and start working with yourself? The only way to find out is to begin. Deep within you, beneath the layers of conditioning and the masks of social acceptance, lives an ancient knowing. It remembers what you were before you learned to divide yourself into acceptable and unacceptable parts. It holds the blueprint of your wholeness, waiting patiently for you to remember who you truly are beneath all the personas you've constructed and all the aspects you've rejected. This knowing speaks to you through symbols, through images, that bypass the analytical mind and touch something primal and true. These aren't merely metaphors or poetic language. They are archetypal patterns that connect you to the deepest truths about human transformation and the journey toward authentic selfhood. The river that knows its banks. Imagine yourself as a river that has been taught to be ashamed of its banks. You've been told that a good river flows only in the middle, staying safely away from the edges where the current becomes turbulent, where debris collects, where the water seems murky and unpredictable. So you've tried to narrow yourself, to flow only in the safe center channel, believing this makes you pure and admirable. But what happens to a river that denies its banks? It becomes a weak trickle, easily diverted by every obstacle, lacking the power to carve canyons or nourish the landscape around it. The banks aren't the enemy of the river. They are what give it shape, direction, and force. Without them, there is no river at all, only scattered puddles with no coherent flow. Your shadow aspects are the banks of your psychological river. Your anger provides one bank. It creates the boundary that gives your kindness shape and power. Your selfishness forms the other bank. It ensures your generosity flows from abundance rather than depletion. Your sadness, your fear, your capacity for manipulation and control, these aren't contaminations in your pure flow. They are the very structures that allow your flow to have direction and impact. When you embrace your complete riverscape, something profound happens. Your compassion gains the fierce edge it needs to actually reduce suffering rather than simply feeling good about being sympathetic. Your generosity develops the wisdom to know when giving serves growth and when it enables dysfunction. Your love acquires the strength to set boundaries that protect what is precious, rather than allowing everything to be violated in the name of acceptance. The river that knows its banks can carve grand canyons. It can provide the force that generates hydroelectric power. It can nourish entire ecosystems while maintaining its essential nature and direction. But this requires accepting the totality of its landscape. The rocks, the fallen trees, the sediment, the seasonal flooding that brings destruction and renewal in equal measure. You are this river. Your consciousness is the flow. and your complete psychological landscape, light and shadow integrated, provides the banks that give your life force, shape, and power. When you try to eliminate your darker banks, you don't become a better river. You become a weaker one, easily scattered by every wind, lacking the concentrated force necessary to create anything lasting or significant. Learn to honor your complete riverscape. Understand that your capacity for righteous anger is what prevents your compassion from becoming enabling sympathy. Know that your healthy selfishness is what allows your giving to come from overflow rather than deficit. Recognize that your strategic thinking, yes, even your capacity for manipulation, can become skillful influence that serves the highest good for everyone involved. The river doesn't apologize for having banks. It doesn't try to eliminate the geological forces that shaped its course. It simply flows with maximum power and purpose because it encompasses its complete landscape rather than fighting against it. What would it feel like to flow with this kind of integrated power? What could you accomplish if you stopped expending energy trying to be only the safe middle current and instead embraced your complete psychological riverscape? What canyons could you carve? What life could you nourish? What force could you generate? The lighthouse that embraces its darkness, standing alone on a rocky cliff, battered by storms and surrounded by treacherous waters, the lighthouse serves a function that no other structure can fulfill. But consider this: what makes a lighthouse effective isn't just its light, it's the profound darkness that surrounds it. Without darkness, there would be no need for the beacon. Without the dangerous rocks and turbulent seas, there would be no purpose for its warning and guidance. You are this lighthouse, and your consciousness is the beacon that can guide others through their own dark passages. But your light gains its meaning and power precisely because you have navigated your own darkness, because you understand intimately the treacherous terrain of human psychology, because you have learned to stand steady in the storms that would topple structures built on denial and false positivity. The lighthouse doesn't pretend the rocks aren't there. It doesn't try to eliminate the storms or calm the seas. It doesn't apologize for the darkness that makes its light necessary. Instead, it becomes a reliable point of reference for others who are trying to navigate the same challenging waters. Its very existence says, yes, these waters are dangerous. Yes, these rocks can destroy you, but there is a way through, and I am here to help you find it. Your integrated shadow, your own capacity for anger, manipulation, selfishness, fear, these become the very qualities that allow you to serve as a lighthouse for others. When you've made peace with your own manipulative tendencies, you can help others recognize and navigate manipulation without being triggered or naive. When you've integrated your own anger, you can help others distinguish between righteous anger that serves justice and reactive anger that creates destruction. The lighthouse keeper has walked every inch of those treacherous rocks. They know where the hidden dangers lie because they've encountered them all personally. This knowledge doesn't make them dark or negative, it makes them useful. Their light shines brighter because it's informed by complete understanding of both the beauty and the peril of the human condition. People are drawn to lighthouses not because they represent perfection, but because they represent reliability. In the midst of uncertainty, they provide guidance not by eliminating darkness, but by remaining steadily luminous within it. They serve others not by pretending danger doesn't exist, but by offering a stable reference point that helps travelers navigate danger successfully. When you integrate your shadow, you become this kind of lighthouse for others. Your presence reassures people not because you're perfect, but because you're whole. Your guidance helps others not because you've eliminated your capacity for human darkness, but because you've learned to work with it consciously. Your light shines brighter not despite your darkness, but because of your honest relationship with it. The lighthouse that denied the existence of rocks and storms would be useless to sailors. The lighthouse that became depressed about the darkness surrounding it would fail in its essential function. But the lighthouse that accepts its complete environment while maintaining its essential purpose becomes an invaluable gift to everyone trying to navigate treacherous waters. You stand on the rocky cliff of your own life, surrounded by the storms, and dangerous waters of human existence. You can try to pretend these challenges don't exist, maintaining a false light that provides no real guidance to anyone. Or you can embrace your role as a lighthouse, acknowledging the complete landscape, while shining your authentic light steadily through whatever darkness surrounds you. What kind of lighthouse will you choose to be? Will you shine the artificial light of spiritual bypassing and positive thinking, providing false hope that will ultimately lead others into the very rocks you pretend don't exist? Or will you offer the genuine beacon of integrated consciousness, a light that acknowledges danger while providing reliable guidance through it? The ships lost in the storm don't need your light to eliminate their darkness. They need it to navigate through their darkness safely. This is the gift you offer when you become whole, not the elimination of human struggle, but the wisdom and strength to move through it with grace and purpose. The sculptor who honors the stone in the quarry of human consciousness, you are both the sculptor and the stone. For too long you have approached this sacred work with the amateur's misconception that sculpting means eliminating everything you don't want, chiseling away at yourself until only some idealized form remains. But the master sculptor knows a different truth. The greatest art emerges when you work with the natural grain and character of the stone rather than against it. Michelangelo famously said that he didn't create David, he simply removed everything. That wasn't David. But what most people miss is that he could only do this because he spent time understanding the stone completely. He studied its veins, its densities, its natural fault lines and areas of strength. He worked with the inherent qualities of the marble rather than trying to force it into a shape that violated its essential nature. Your psyche is this marble, and every quality you possess, your anger, your sadness, your selfishness, your fear, represents veins and textures in the stone of your being. The amateur approach tries to chisel away everything deemed unacceptable, often creating fractures that weaken the entire structure. The master approach studies these qualities carefully, learning how they can be shaped and integrated to create something both beautiful and strong. Your anger isn't a flaw to be eliminated. It's a vein of intensity that can be carved into passionate advocacy for justice. Your sadness isn't a weakness to be removed. It's a deep texture that can become profound empathy and emotional wisdom. Your manipulative tendencies aren't defects to be chiseled away. They can be sculpted into skillful influence that serves the highest good. The master sculptor doesn't work against the stone. They work with it. They understand that trying to force marble into an unnatural shape will either break the tool or shatter the stone. Instead, they learn to see the potential that exists within the natural structure of the material, then carefully and patiently bring out that potential through conscious, skillful work. This requires a completely different relationship with the raw material of your humanity. Instead of seeing your negative traits as obstacles to overcome, you begin to see them as essential components of your authentic masterpiece. Instead of approaching them with hammers and chisels meant for destruction, you approach them with the fine tools of consciousness and integration. The sculptor spends years learning to read stone, understanding how it responds to different pressures, what techniques bring out its natural beauty, how to work with its inherent structure rather than against it. Similarly, shadow integration requires learning to read your own psychological material with this same patience and skill. Your jealousy, when studied carefully, reveals information about your deepest values and unmet longings. Your pride, when approached with the right tools, can be sculpted into healthy self-respect and confidence. Your laziness, when understood properly, might actually be your psyche's wisdom about when rest and reflection are more valuable than action. The master sculptor knows that the most beautiful art often incorporates the natural flaws and variations in the stone, rather than trying to create artificial perfection. The crack becomes part of the design. The unusual coloration becomes a feature that adds character and uniqueness. The dense areas that resist easy carving become elements that provide strength and stability to the whole structure. When you approach your shadow work with this sculptor's consciousness, everything changes. You stop trying to create a personality that looks perfect from a distance and start crafting a character that is genuinely beautiful, precisely because it incorporates your complete humanity. You develop the patience to work with your natural, psychological material rather than fighting against it. This work requires the sculptor's patience. Transformation doesn't happen overnight, and attempts to force rapid change often damage the delicate work being done. The stone must be approached with respect, with careful attention to its responses, with willingness to adjust technique based on what the material is teaching you about itself. The sculptor who tries to rush the process creates inferior art. The one who becomes frustrated with the stone's natural resistance often abandons projects before completion. But the master who develops genuine relationship with their material, who learns to listen to what the stone wants to become rather than forcing it into preconceived shapes, creates art that endures for centuries. You are both the sculptor and the stone in the masterpiece of your own becoming. The question isn't whether you have difficult material to work with. Everyone does. The question is whether you'll approach that material with the amateur's impatience and destructive tools, or with the master's patience and skillful techniques. Will you continue trying to chisel away everything about yourself that doesn't match some external ideal of perfection? Will you keep fracturing your own foundation by working against your natural psychological grain, or will you develop the sculptor's consciousness, the ability to see the masterpiece that wants to emerge from your complete humanity, flaws and all? The greatest sculptures in history aren't perfect in any conventional sense. They're powerful because they capture something essentially human, the integration of strength and vulnerability, beauty and imperfection, light and shadow. They endure because they tell the truth about what it means to be human, rather than presenting artificial ideals that inspire only from a distance. Your life can become this kind of masterpiece, but only if you're willing to work with your complete psychological material rather than trying to eliminate half of it. Only if you develop the patience to understand your anger, your sadness, your fear, your selfishness as essential components of your authentic expression rather than defects to be removed. The sculptor's chisel in your hands can create destruction or beauty, depending on how skillfully you wield it. The stone of your psyche can become either a pile of rubble from attempts to force it into unnatural shapes, or a masterpiece that reflects the unique beauty of your complete humanity. What will you choose to create? What masterpiece is waiting to emerge from the raw material of your wholeness? What would you discover about your own potential if you stopped fighting your psychological material and started sculpting with it instead? The stone is waiting. The tools of consciousness are in your hands. The only question is whether you have the courage and patience to become the master sculptor of your own authentic becoming. The choice, as always, is yours. But remember, whether you choose to work with your complete humanity or against it, you are sculpting something. The only question is whether you'll create a masterpiece or a pile of broken fragments. Every day you spend trying to eliminate parts of yourself is another day you postpone the emergence of your authentic masterpiece. Every moment you resist your natural psychological grain is energy that could be directed toward conscious, skillful integration. Every tool you pick up in anger or frustration rather than patience and skill creates fractures that weaken the entire structure of your becoming. But when you approach yourself with the sculptor's consciousness, when you develop genuine respect for your complete psychological material, you begin to create something that has never existed before. Your authentic self, shaped not by external expectations, but by skillful integration of your complete humanity. This is the promise of shadow work, not the creation of artificial perfection, but the emergence of authentic mastery, not the elimination of your humanity, but the conscious sculpting of it into its most beautiful and powerful expression, in the spaces between words, in the pause between breath and action, in the silence that follows your deepest understanding of yourself, lives a power that the unconscious person can never access. This is the power that emerges when you no longer need to prove anything, defend anything, or hide anything about your complete humanity. It is the power of the integrated being who has learned to work with their totality rather than against it. You have traveled through the landscape of shadow integration, from the initial recognition of your split self to the daily practices of reclamation, from the theoretical understanding of wholeness to the symbolic templates that guide your becoming. Now comes the final and most subtle mastery, learning to operate from stillness, to act from detachment, and to live from the unshakable foundation of complete self-knowledge. The strategic power of silence. Most people speak and act from unconscious compulsion, driven by the need to prove their worth, defend their position, or maintain their carefully constructed persona. They fill every silence with nervous chatter. They respond to every provocation with immediate reaction. They volunteer information, opinions, and emotions without conscious choice, bleeding energy in all directions while wondering why they feel chronically drained and ineffective. But when you have integrated your shadow, when you no longer fear what others might discover about you because you have already discovered it yourself, a profound shift occurs in your relationship with silence and space. You begin to understand that the most powerful position is often the one that requires saying and doing nothing at all. Practice the art of the pregnant pause. When someone makes a comment designed to provoke you, instead of immediately defending or attacking, simply pause, breathe, feel the impulse to react, acknowledge it internally, then choose your response from a place of conscious intention rather than unconscious compulsion. This isn't passive aggression or withdrawal. It's the strategic use of space to maintain your center, while allowing others to reveal themselves more fully. The person who has integrated their own manipulative tendencies can recognize manipulation in others without being triggered by it. They can choose to respond or not respond based on what serves the highest good, rather than what serves their ego's need to be right or win. When someone criticizes you, pause before defending yourself. Ask, is there truth in this criticism that I can learn from? Is this person trying to provoke me into unconscious reaction? What response would come from my integrated self rather than my defensive ego? Often you'll discover that silence is more powerful than any defense, and that people reveal their true intentions more clearly when they don't get the reaction they're seeking. Use silence as a tool for gathering information. When someone is speaking from unconscious patterns, whether that's projection, manipulation, or emotional reactivity, give them space to fully express themselves without interruption. Listen not just to their words, but to the underlying motivations and unmet needs driving their behavior. This information becomes invaluable for choosing how to respond most effectively. The integrated person understands that every situation doesn't require their input, opinion, or emotional energy. They can watch drama unfold without being pulled into it. They can witness others' unconscious patterns without feeling compelled to fix, judge, or react. This isn't indifference. It's the result of having done enough inner work that you're no longer triggered by behaviors you've recognized and integrated in yourself. Master the art of strategic non-engagement. When someone tries to draw you into unconscious patterns, whether that's argument, gossip, complaint, or any form of energy drain, you can simply choose not to participate. I can see you're frustrated about this. I hope you find a good solution. Then redirect your attention to something more constructive. This doesn't mean becoming cold or uncaring. It means learning to distinguish between situations where your engagement will serve growth and situations where it will simply feed unconscious patterns. The person who has integrated their own need for drama and conflict can recognize these dynamics in others without being compelled to participate. The freedom of detachment from outcomes. One of the most profound shifts that occurs through shadow integration is the release from the desperate need for specific outcomes. When you're operating from an unintegrated position, you need the world to respond to you in particular ways in order to maintain your sense of identity and worth. You need others to validate your goodness, confirm your specialness, or mirror back the persona you're trying to maintain. This need for specific outcomes makes you manipulative, whether you recognize it or not. You give in order to receive. You perform kindness to be seen as kind. You share your struggles to be comforted. You help others to feel important. There's nothing wrong with any of these motivations, but when they're unconscious, they create attachment to outcomes that makes you vulnerable to disappointment, resentment, and reactive behavior when things don't go as you hoped. When you've integrated your shadow, you begin to understand that your worth doesn't depend on other people's responses. Your kindness doesn't become less valuable if others don't appreciate it. Your contributions don't lose their meaning if they're not recognized. Your growth doesn't require external validation to be real and significant. This detachment isn't indifference or spiritual bypassing. It's the natural result of having a complete relationship with yourself that doesn't require external confirmation. When you know your own capacity for both construction and destruction, when you've made peace with your complete humanity, you become less dependent on others' opinions and reactions to maintain your sense of self. Practice offering your gifts without attachment to how they're received. Give your full attention to conversations without needing the other person to respond in any particular way. Share your authentic thoughts and feelings without requiring agreement or approval. Take actions that align with your values without demanding that others appreciate or understand your choices. This practice reveals how much energy you've been spending trying to control outcomes that are ultimately beyond your control. When you release this attachment, you discover tremendous freedom and power. You can give your best to situations without being emotionally dependent on specific results. You can love without demanding to be loved in return. You can contribute without needing recognition or appreciation. The detached person isn't less caring. They're more effective. They can respond to situations based on what's actually needed, rather than what will produce the outcome they're hoping for. They can make decisions based on principles rather than the desire to be seen in a particular way. They can take risks because their sense of worth isn't dependent on success or failure. This detachment becomes particularly powerful in relationships. When you're not desperately trying to get others to validate your worth or confirm your identity, you can see them more clearly and respond to who they actually are rather than who you need them to be. You can set boundaries without anger because you're not taking their behavior personally. You can offer support without resentment because you're not giving in order to receive. The discipline of daily integration, shadow integration, isn't a one-time event or a weekend workshop revelation. It's a daily practice that requires the same consistency and dedication as physical fitness or musical mastery. The unconscious. Patterns you've spent decades developing don't dissolve simply because you've had insights about them. They require ongoing conscious attention and redirection. Establish a daily practice of conscious gratitude that includes appreciation for your complete humanity. Each morning, spend 5 minutes acknowledging not just the pleasant aspects of your life, but also the difficult experiences that have contributed to your growth. Thank your anger for protecting your boundaries. Appreciate your sadness for teaching you empathy. Acknowledge your fear for keeping you safe and prepared. This isn't toxic positivity or trying to convince yourself that everything bad is actually good. It's developing genuine appreciation for the complete ecosystem of your humanity, recognizing that every emotion and impulse serves a function when understood and integrated consciously. Practice daily meditation that focuses on observing your thoughts and reactions without immediately judging or trying to change them. Sit quietly for 10 to 20 minutes and simply notice what arises in your consciousness. When judgmental thoughts about others appear, ask, what aspect of myself am I seeing reflected here? When self-critical thoughts emerge, explore, what unintegrated part of me is speaking right now? Use your meditation time to develop what Buddhists call witness consciousness, the ability to observe your mental and emotional processes without being completely identified with them. This creates space for conscious choice rather than unconscious reaction. Develop the discipline of conscious response rather than unconscious reaction in your daily interactions. Before responding to emails, text messages, or requests, pause and ask, what would my integrated self do in this situation? Am I responding from ego or from wholeness? What choice would serve the highest good for everyone involved? This doesn't mean taking forever to make decisions or being paralyzed by analysis. It means developing the habit of checking in with your complete self before acting, ensuring that your responses come from conscious integration rather than unconscious patterns. Practice evening reflection that goes beyond simple gratitude too. Include honest assessment of your shadow expressions during the day. Today I noticed myself being specific trait when specific situation occurred. How did this serve me? How did it affect others? What would conscious integration of this trait look like tomorrow? This evening practice helps you develop ongoing relationship with your shadow rather than occasional acknowledgement of it. Consistency in this reflection creates the foundation for genuine transformation rather than temporary insights that don't translate into changed behavior. Establish boundaries around your time and energy that honor your complete humanity rather than trying to maintain impossible standards of perpetual availability and positivity. Say no to requests that drain your energy without contributing to your growth or service. Set limits on conversations that pull you into others' unconscious patterns. Protect time for practices that support your integration work. This isn't selfishness, it's wisdom. The person who maintains their psychological health and energy can contribute much more effectively than someone who is chronically depleted from trying to be everything to everyone. The integration of understanding as you reflect on this journey, through shadow integration, certain essential truths become unshakable foundations for your continued growth. You have learned that the parts of yourself you try to eliminate don't disappear. They operate unconsciously, creating the very problems you're trying to avoid. You have discovered that every emotion and impulse serves a function when understood and integrated consciously. You now understand that psychological maturity isn't about becoming perfect, but about becoming whole. You've learned that the people who trigger you most intensely are often mirrors showing you disowned aspects of yourself that need integration. You've discovered that authentic power comes not from transcending your humanity, but from embracing it completely while choosing consciously how to express it. The practices you've learned, the mirror of reactivity, the daily shadow inventory, the integration dialogue, the conscious expression experiments, the projection reclamation process. These aren't temporary exercises, but lifelong tools for maintaining conscious relationship with your complete self. The symbolic templates, the river that knows its banks, the lighthouse that embraces its darkness, the sculptor who honors the stone. These provide ongoing guidance for navigating the inevitable challenges of human existence while maintaining your integrity and wholeness. You have learned that silence and space can be more powerful than immediate reaction. That detachment from outcomes creates more freedom than desperate attachment to specific results, and that daily discipline in integration work is what transforms insights into lasting change. Most importantly, you now understand that you have a choice. You can continue living as a split person, trying to maintain impossible standards while unconsciously expressing your disowned traits in destructive ways. Or you can embrace the path of integration, learning to work with your complete humanity as the raw material for authentic mastery and genuine contribution. The call to mastery. The knowledge you now possess carries with it a responsibility. You cannot unknown what you have learned about the shadow, about projection, about the costs of psychological splitting. You cannot return to the innocent ignorance of believing that eliminating your negative traits will make you a better person. This knowledge is both a gift and a burden. It's a gift because it provides the tools for authentic transformation and genuine freedom. It's a burden because it requires ongoing consciousness and choice rather than the unconscious comfort of automatic patterns. The world needs people who have done this work. Society is filled with unconscious individuals projecting their shadows onto scapegoats, creating enemies to carry what they refuse to own about themselves. Politics, relationships, organizations, and communities all suffer from the collective unconsciousness of people who haven't learned to integrate their complete humanity. When you commit to this path of integration, you become part of the solution rather than part of the problem. You stop contributing to the unconscious chaos and start modeling what conscious wholeness looks like. You become someone others can trust because you're not hiding essential parts of yourself that might emerge unexpectedly in destructive ways. Begin immediately. Don't wait for perfect understanding or ideal circumstances. Start today with whatever situation is currently challenging you. Use it as shadow work material. Ask yourself, what am I seeing in this situation that I refuse to acknowledge in myself? How can I reclaim this projection and transform it into conscious integration? The path of shadow integration isn't comfortable, but it's the most practical work you can do. Every aspect of yourself that operates unconsciously is a potential source of self-sabotage. Every integrated aspect becomes a source of power, creativity, and authentic presence. Remember the river that gained power by acknowledging its complete banks. Recall the lighthouse that served others by embracing its surrounding darkness. Hold the image of the sculptor who created masterpieces by working with the stone's natural character rather than against it. These are your templates for living. Not as someone who has eliminated their capacity for selfishness, anger, manipulation, or fear, but as someone who has learned to work with these qualities consciously and constructively. Not as a perfect being, but as a whole one. Not as someone who has transcended humanity, but as someone who has learned to express their complete humanity with wisdom and skill. The choice is before you in every moment. In every interaction, you can choose conscious response or unconscious reaction. In every relationship, you can choose projection or integration. In every challenge, you can choose to use the situation for growth or to remain trapped in familiar patterns. When you master shadow integration, when you develop genuine relationship with your complete humanity, nothing and no one can shake your foundation. You become unmanipulable because you've owned your own manipulative tendencies. You become unshakable because you've made peace with your own capacity for every human response. You become truly free because you're no longer imprisoned by the need to maintain impossible personas or hide essential parts of yourself. This is the promise and the path. Not the elimination of your darkness, but the conscious integration of it. Not the transcendence of your humanity, but the complete embrace of it. Not perfection, but wholeness. Not the absence of struggle, but the mastery of struggle through conscious relationship with all aspects of yourself. The time for half-living is over. The choice for wholeness is yours to make, and it begins now in this moment with whatever situation you're currently facing. What will you choose? Will you continue fighting yourself, or will you finally come home to your complete humanity? When you dominate shadow integration, when you learn to work with your complete psychological material rather than against it, nothing and no one can shake your foundation because you have reclaimed the very parts of yourself that were being used against you. You become the master of your own psychological domain, the author of your authentic story, the sculptor of your genuine becoming.